Welcome to NYLA 2020 On Demand. This session was previously recorded for the NYLA 2020 virtual conference. It is available to you through December 31st, 2020. Please note, once viewed, each on-demand program is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. Links to materials and presenter contact information have been archived in a Google folder. The link to the folder can be found in the program description. Any questions about the NYLA 2020 virtual conference digital platform can be directed to Christina@nyla.org, or you can call 800-252-6952. Assessing Your Library's Makerspace is sponsored by MSRT and co-sponsored by SCLA. Welcome to presenter Nick Tanzi. Take it away, Nick.
All right, thank you. So today we're going to be talking about assessing your library's makerspace. I'm the assistant director over at South Huntington Public Library, and I hope everybody's doing well at home in these interesting times that we live in. So just to start with the basics, there's so many different ideas of what a makerspace is. And these are two that to me really kind of hit home and encapsulated what a makerspace is. And it's this idea that makerspaces or DIY social spaces where people meet to create, design, share ideas, and learn. And then a place where people have an opportunity to explore their own interests, learn to use tools and materials, both physical and virtual, and develop creative projects. And one of the things with these makerspaces is this kind of sense of social and DIY and kind of wide open learning opportunity, which can oftentimes make them difficult to assess. And that's partially why I feel like it's an important topic to address. And so, of course, the elephant in the room, while we're talking about these makerspaces that are hands-on and social, they can feel very much at odds with, the current situation with COVID-19. That said, we still have makerspaces. We still can use them effectively, and of course can assess them. And we always have to plan for the future. And so in that context, I want you to think about, you'll see that we're talking very flexible collection of stats. And that flexibility is important because odds are you're going to be very creative with your use of your makerspace. The other piece of that is to think beyond the physical location. And that's something that I think we've all been doing. A lot of us have looked at curbside and virtual programming. And so both the collection of statistics is going to be something that is going to be flexible. We also have to think of making outside of just the physical makerspace, okay? And then of course, it's planning for tomorrow. We don't know what the future holds. We certainly think there'll be something more akin to a return to normal. And so it's never too early to plan for the future. Now, looking at makerspaces and looking at assessment, makerspaces, even the decision to create a makerspace, I'd like to think was a decision that was data-driven. It was something that came out of assessment. And oftentimes the origin of our makerspace is excess meeting rooms or quiet study space. We find that we don't need these spaces. We found a better purpose for them. Oftentimes makerspaces originate out of a downsized circulating collection, right? As our print numbers go down, as our AV numbers go down with streaming media and ebooks, we often reduce the size and footprint of these collections, and then we repurpose that space. And so the birth of a makerspace is data-driven, is coming out of assessment. You've looked at your space, you've decided that statistically, some of your circulation numbers, it doesn't make sense to have that physical footprint for print collection, for analog collection. But then you have your reference collection, and I think that may be even the most common way a makerspace comes about is we reduce the size of our traditional reference collection, that print collection, as much of this has moved to digital. But herein is a trickier part, right? Because your reference collection doesn't generally circulate. And so you don't have those same circ numbers. You don't have that same data that you're looking at to make that assessment that you need to repurpose that space. And so with that in mind, the decision to repurpose space is both made using hard data, right, like your circ stats, and anecdotal evidence. And so you shouldn't dismiss anecdotal evidence. That shouldn't be the sole driver, but how can I maybe figure out that my reference collection isn't being used as much? Well, sure, I can, have staff surveys and I can individually track every time a staff-assisted trip to a reference book is made, or I could just run my finger across the reference collection, and when I get to a quarter inch of dust, that's a pretty good indicator that that collection isn't being used like it had been in the past. So hard data is very good and is important, and and I think should be the main driver. But don't throw common sense out the window. Don't ignore anecdotal evidence. So I first want to talk a little bit about the space we have over at South Huntington. And this is our own makerspace, our own digital media lab, and kind of give you a sense of what we have, how we use it, and then kind of make the pivot to the assessment that I kind of apply to this space and those questions that I have that I seek to answer. And so our technology center opened in July 2018, simpler times, right? And it is located in the adult department, and it's actually on the footprint of the original reference collection. So much like I talked about in that previous slide, that was born out of diminished use of our traditional reference collection. While it exists within the adult space, it is utilized by all ages, children, teens, and adults. And like most makerspaces, it was built with collaboration in mind. So there are, 20 computers, there are 4K TVs that are all set to operate in work groups. So they can kind of, you can share screens easily. You can make kind of smaller collaborative groups with these computers. And of course, you can always bring in people from the outside with virtual conferencing. And this space is highly visible, which was important to draw the eye in and have people get interested, but it's also soundproof within reason. So as long as you're not screaming, it does a good job of capturing the noise. And within the space, some of our key equipment, we have 4 3D printers. 2 of them are SLA, the liquid resin, and 2 of them are the FDM, fused deposition modeling, which is a fancy word for it melts plastic and the plastic hardens. And we also have a large format printer. This is a traditional poster printer. We have a number of computers, which have a suite of design software, anything from 3D modeling to your Adobe suite. And a number of kind of representative technologies. We have coding and robotics, and that's everything from your Ozobots and Makey kits. We have augmented and virtual reality, both the all-in-one and the computer tethered ones. And again, we have kind of this digital media creation going on there. So you can do video editing, photo editing, you can do 3D modeling. And while that's the stuff that we have, here our space in terms of use, we have a number of things going on. And I think you'll notice there's certainly a shift here. But we have open lab hours. That's where anybody can kind of come in and use. We have tech appointments when somebody has a specific need and they're able to reserve time. We've done a lot of school visits and tours. Now, obviously, at this time, that's something that we've kind of walked back because we do use it as a hands-on training space. We do professional development with our teachers. We host school visits, and they often do assignments within this space. But by and large, right now, especially in the month of September, October, where there's all this distance learning kind of taking off, we're taking a wait and see attitude with this. So it's largely by appointment right now. Also some open hours, although we have to practice social distancing. And so, I've kind of showed you a bit of the space and some of these sample technologies that I think, when you look at your own makerspaces, is probably very similar. But of course, now the question in assessment, it always starts with a question, and it's, what am I seeking to answer about my makerspace? What do I want to learn? And once I have that in place, I can start figuring out how best to answer that. So for me, I need to know how many people are using my space, right? Those typical door count numbers that we use, much like program attendance. I also want to know not just how many people are using my space, but what's being used, what specific technologies, because knowing that allows me to place resources where they're best being used. It also lets me know maybe what technologies I can draw down on, or maybe what needs a little marketing push. I also want to know what my users are learning. Are they just coming in and having fun? Is there a specific thing they're seeking to learn? Or are they having a good learning outcome? I want to know what value is being delivered. All right, these are things, at the end of the day, we answer to our taxpayers, right? And I want to make sure that I am delivering value and I am communicating that value to my stakeholders. And finally, I want to know what else are my users interested in? Not just do they like what I have, but what don't I have that they want? And that can often be a tricky question to answer. So once I have my questions in place that I'm seeking to answer, the next piece is providing the data and collecting the data and interpreting said data in a way that allows me to answer these questions. And so let's start with how many people are using my space? Well, there's ways I can get this information. I can certainly require a sign-in in order to use my space. And when I do that, there is always a high-tech and a low-tech solution, and of course, something that falls somewhere in between. For example, a high-tech solution would be some sort of registration portal or a login portal. You could get crazy with it. It could be biometric, or it could simply be something that you sign in with your library card in order to use the space. Low tech would be that simple sign-in sheet, right? And that could be staff mediated or not, but pen and paper, nothing wrong with that. And then I'm sure there's something that falls somewhere in between. So you can go crazy with it, or you can probably just use a Google form. And then it really becomes a question of if you're restricting to cardholder, then obviously you would want to validate barcode. When you're signing in, you want to measure distinct users, right? So that's something where, you know, um, identifying not just how many times a space is used, but if you're tracking individual use. So, if it looks like my space is used 100 times a week, but it's two people using it 50 times, those are two very different stories. And maker spaces are often driven by power users. So you want to make sure that you're actually distinguishing between distinct users. And obviously, if you're using barcode sign-in, or if somebody's identifying by name, that's helpful as well. Program attendance is another good way to determine how many people are using the space. If you're doing maker programs and they're happening within the context of the makerspace, then of course it's an easy thing to check your program attendance numbers and count that as your makerspace use. You can install a door counter. That's a nice, easy way to at least get foot traffic. It doesn't give you much data beyond that. It won't tell you how the space is being used. If you have somebody that likes to pace when they're in a creative mode, they may hit that door counter many times. But that's a nice passive way to track a space, and that works well if the space is enclosed. There's one way in, one way out. Um, that's a nice passive way to collect data. And then you can perform spot checks. In many youth services departments where maybe you have that little family place section where there's toys and activities, you often don't take attendance, right? But what you may do is do a spot check every hour on the hour or every 2 or 3 hours. And that's a way to identify, how much use a place is seeing and also place it within a time frame. So that can help you too with staffing concerns. You can determine how much a space is being used and when. Now, obviously, if somebody is a long-term user and they're there all day, they may be counted multiple times. Um, so that wouldn't necessarily, that would muddy the waters a bit, although it also would point to a certain level of engagement that somebody's spending that much time within your space. So one of the other questions I'm seeking to answer is what's being used, right? And now that we're in a pandemic situation, and we oftentimes have a sanitation protocol here in place, that becomes more important as well, right? You need to know what's being touched so that you can also clean it. Um, but in the context of a makerspace, I want to know what's being used so you know, um, I can throw more resources at those things that are being used and less resources at those that aren't. One of the ways you can track what's being used is simply to track your machine outputs. And by that, I mean, if I have a vinyl cutter, how many jobs is that thing performing? How many jobs is my laser engraver performing? How many 3D prints am I sending out to the public? And that can be a good sense of what's being used. Now that our physical space, we have to get a little more creative, here's where equipment checkouts can serve you well. Not everything happens in the context of the makerspace. It may be taken home, or you may need to check out a piece of equipment that does get used within the library. So if you're doing checkouts, you can track your equipment use, things like VR headsets, robotics kits, your Ozobots. Somebody wants to use them, they check them out, you collect that data, and now you have a good sense of what gets used and how often. For your computers and your mobile devices, your tablets, you can track what software is being used. For example, you can place an MDM solution, that's mobile device management, or some sort of desktop tracking, so that you are keeping track of what software gets used. And that can be helpful. If you're paying for 20 Adobe Photoshop licenses and it's just not getting used that often, you can have that number, for example, and save yourself some money and place it somewhere else. Or you may find that your software is always in use and you don't have enough licenses, and then you can purchase some more and license some new computers to meet that demand. I want to say too that best practice is if you're using your mobile device management or any kind of desktop tracking, you want to be transparent with your patrons, right? You're using that information for statistical purposes, but you're not revealing the frequency and content of individual library visits. Okay, you need to still maintain patron privacy. So always be upfront about that you're at least tracking use, and be clear about the purpose of that. And then of course, you can rely on self-reporting. People can come and visit your makerspace and they just indicate to you what they planned on using either at the outset or at the end of their visit. They just check off something that says what they used. Now, that's about as reliable as it may sound. It's also not terribly onerous, so there's that, at least it's easy. But that is an option. And in particular, if your staff is spread thin, that may be the thing you rely on. And there are ways to encourage self-reporting too that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So obviously, within my makerspace, I want to learn, I want to know some learning outcomes. I want to know what my users are learning. And, these types of outcomes, oftentimes we track in academia, in university settings and school settings, but they're very important in public library settings as well. And part of this too is akin to delivering value. And so when I want to determine what my users are learning, certifications is one way. And by certifications, for example, if I'm a patron and I want to use your 3D printer, I may need to take a safety course and an orientation course before I'm allowed to just get my hands on that printer. So if I'm tracking how many people are certified in certain equipment and certain functions, that's something I can track, and that's a learning outcome. Now I have somebody who's comfortable with additive manufacturing, right, 3D printing, because they took a safety course. So, these are things that can be library generated, right? You can make your own certification that somebody's now certified to use your VR equipment or your 3D printer or your vinyl cutter or your laser engraver. Um, then there's those that can be done by your partner organization. And now those can be formal certifications. So imagine my makerspace has a kitchen and I partner with the Department of Health so that we can offer an on-site food safety course. That's something where at the end of the day, your partner organization gives a formal certification, right? You get a food handler license or a food safety certificate. And that's something that I can track how many people got. And that's clearly something that is of value and is important to note. Then there's those still informal um, certifications that happen from your partner organizations. Maybe you're working with Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. There's really a movement now towards maker badges in these organizations. And that's something that the partner organization tracks, but it's helpful information to have on hand, right? That's a learning outcome that's captured by that certification. If you're doing classes, oftentimes with a makerspace, there's kind of this pyramid of engagement where you start with really basic generalist classes, and then you get more and more complex. And so if your courses have prerequisites, you can track what people are learning over time, right? Maybe they're taking a 3D basics course, maybe they're taking an intermediate design class, and maybe at the end of many, many weeks in classes, they've moved on now to taking, advanced prototyping or something of that sort. That's a good way to track as well. So who's graduated from the beginner and intermediate courses into your advanced courses? And then earlier we talked about self-reporting. Well, one of the things that can aid self-reporting is making it fun, is that gamification. So if you have a badging system, and this works really well in youth services, where you can earn your 3D printing badge and your virtual reality badge and your robotics badge, you can have the stuff available. You can set the curriculum. It can be self-directed, user-directed, or library staff-directed. But at the end of the day, the individual still reports their progress, and they're more inclined to do so because they're earning badges because it's fun. So that's something to consider as well. It takes a lot of the tracking away from the staff, and it makes your job a little easier and less labor intensive, and at the same time makes it fun and helps aid the self-reporting. Of course, I want to track what value am I delivering. So one of the ways you can do that is to compare your services to commercial alternatives, right? So for example, think of even outside the context of the makerspace. If I have a copy machine, I want to make sure that my black and white copies are at least competitive. If they cost more than going to Staples, then why am I doing this? Am I really giving, I'm not delivering value. I'm not doing anyone any favors. And in fact, I'm probably profiting on the venture, which isn't great. So compare your services to commercial alternatives. Um, so when you're offering a service, make sure that it is less expensive than, so, if I'm doing virtual reality or some sort of gaming, it should be cheaper than if I went into a store to do this. And then we look at comparing consumables to commercial alternatives. So in the context of 3D printing, my filament cost should be break even, right? Or it shouldn't really be much more expensive than sending to a third party alternative. So you want to be able to deliver value. And here I have the example of at our library, our pricing model, if you had this Mr. Shark printed, based on our cost of 15 cents a gram, that print would cost 75 cents. If instead you went to a third party like Sculpteo, which is actually fairly affordable in the grand scheme of things, it would be $7.48. So I can sleep at night knowing that we've covered our printing costs while at the same time delivering real value to our patrons. And so, in particular with emerging technologies, when the technology is expensive and prohibitively so for your patrons, the library can provide critical access. So anything you're doing, any service or any consumable that you're offering, make sure that it is competitive. Make sure that it is delivering value to your patrons. Otherwise, I don't see why they wouldn't just choose a commercial alternative. And so, we've talked about measuring all the things people are doing and what they're interested in, but you have to kind of figure out what are those things that I'm not offering that I should be. So you never want to get in the habit of only evaluating what you have. Now, to determine those other things that maybe folks are interested in that you're not offering, surveys are a good way. And again, you can always do these things high tech or low tech. It can be done pen and paper, or it can be done digitally, or it can be done both, and just make sure that you're collecting all that data centrally somewhere. Again, you never want to dismiss anecdotal evidence. Have conversations with patrons. See what they're interested in. See what they mention at the desk. See what emails they send you. Because when folks are communicating this to you, it clearly they're invested in it and they have something to say, and you want your makerspace ultimately to be user driven. You don't want to determine what people want. You want them to tell you what they want, and then the library respond by allocating resources accordingly. And so we've talked a little bit, well, more than a little bit, but we've looked at all these different questions we're looking to answer and all the types of data we can collect. But I also want to put some of this into context too. And one of the things you have to determine too is your internal and external customers. You're not just strictly tracking what your patrons are doing. If you're doing that, you're only getting half the picture. So internal customers, think of staff. External customers, think of the public, think of your patrons. So ensure that you are tracking internal use. Your makerspace can deliver value to staff. Think of all the training that you can offer to your staff in your makerspace. Think of the customizations that you can do with things like a 3D printer or vinyl cutter. You may be able to repair and replace things if you have sewing machines and your printers. That's value. If I don't have to buy something, I can fix something within my makerspace. Think of the things you may be creating that you didn't have to buy. That's all value. So training staff is delivering value. Repairing things instead of having to repurchase, and creating instead of having to go and buy, are all, at the end of the day, delivers value to your organization. So definitely make sure that you're not just tracking your staff use or your public use. Also track your staff use. And we looked at a lot of different ways of assessing. You need to strike a balance in makerspace assessment. You could be, if you're too onerous with your data collection, it can drive users away. If you're too passive, you don't get a clear enough picture. So the characteristics of very onerous data collection, on the positive side, you do get more detailed statistics. However, the drawback is it can stifle creativity. People are coming to kind of collaborate and be in this creative space, and if they're constantly filling out forms and having to self-report and do all this stuff, that can stifle their creativity. And it can become labor intensive, both for your patrons, but for your staff. If your staff are constantly spending their days having to sort through and collect data, that's not ideal either. And as we know, time is money. On the flip side, with passive data collection, it's a better creative space, right? If you can just walk in, do what you want, walk right out, that's nice and easy for the public. But it also leaves you more reliant on self-reporting, which by nature is going to be inaccurate. And so you more than likely you're going to want to strike a balance between those two extremes. You want to make it fairly straightforward to collect data. You don't want it to take up too much time on the patron or staff side, but you want a product that gives you as much detailed information as possible. And ultimately, when you collect data, there are ways to present it, right? Um, and so data is great at informing your decision making, but in terms of winning the public over and maintaining public support, stories help. So you need to think about how your data can be packaged and presented for public consumption with storytelling in mind. And I'll give the example of 3D printing. A rather dry take would be like, in May, our printer was used for 60 hours. Okay, that's great. I mean, I guess that's a big number. I guess that's a lot, but that doesn't move the dial with people's feelings. But if I talk about last month, 16 patrons, learn the basics of additive manufacturing, well, that's a story. Okay, people learned something. They came away with this. Um, and you can share individual stories of these patrons if they're willing, of what they learned, how excited they are, showcasing projects. So on the back end, you want the data, the raw data, but then you want to package it as a narrative, particularly on social media, even in reports for the public consumption, in a way that's exciting and readable and isn't just a dry take. If it feels like you're taking a statistics class, it's probably not winning over new converts. And then finally, one of the keys is you have to be intellectually honest. So when you're assessing, you should be seeking answers to questions. This should be real questions you have and you really want an answer, not a predetermined outcome. If you're seeking a predetermined outcome, any of us can cook the books on anything. You don't want that. And the key is bad results, and I use bad in quotes here, but bad results are still good information. If I do some assessment, I find out my robotics kits are just not getting used. Yeah, that's sad, but now I can at least go and improve the product. Now I can say maybe I shouldn't buy as much robotics kits in the future, or maybe I need to create more programming around them, or maybe I need to engage in better marketing. So even if the outcome when you're assessing is not a great story, that's important because you can still make data-driven decisions. Okay, we have limited funds, we have limited staff. We want them all pointed in the right direction, and you want to operate. You don't want to be operating out of ignorance. So seek honest answers to honest questions, get the best data you can, and then make informed decisions. So I and a couple of colleagues have written a book on makerspaces. So if that's something, or some emerging technologies. So if that's kind of your jam, definitely check it out. I'm going to leave up my contact information. Always happy to talk tech. So feel free to reach out. I'm on Twitter. You can track me down on LinkedIn. It's my website. Got my email and phone number. So I hope this has been valuable today. Definitely, these are interesting times, and I think, change is the only constant. But certainly, this is an opportunity both to take a flexible model of makerspace assessment, given the current circumstance, and also plan for the future when hopefully there's a little more of that in-person collaboration going on. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. This concludes the NILA 2020 on-demand program, Assessing Your Library's Makerspace. We hope you continue to take advantage of all the on-demand and live programs the NILA 2020 annual virtual conference has to offer. Thank you for helping us make this the best virtual conference ever.